putting aside the really poor education that I received, putting aside the conversion therapy, putting aside the campus culture of homophobia, putting aside, the judgmental sort of atmosphere of the school, it was a lot of fun.
Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. I am Jen, this is James, this is Fundie Fridays, and here on my channel I talk about different aspects of Christian fundamentalism, while usually doing my makeup, not doing my makeup today. Anyways, we were talking to Lucas W.F. Wilson.
Lucas F.W. Wilson, but details. Right, we here in Canada, we have oftentimes multiple middle names. My name's Lucas Frederick William Wilson, like the most waspy friggin' name you could ever hear, right?
Lucas F.W. Wilson does kind of have a I wrote novels in the 1840s kind of feel to it, doesn't it?
You have so many titles that I don't even know where to begin. Would you like to explain what all your education is? And
this ain't no time to be humble. You brag here. You brag.
I don't want initials. I want you to say what they all are.
No, your guess is as good as mine, to be honest. No, I have an undergrad in English, though that's a questionable undergrad, and I guess we'll get to that. I have a master's of arts in English. I have a master's in theological studies. And I am about to finish my PhD in comparative studies, which is essentially choose your own adventure in the humanities.
Okay, well,
So
I'm going to
cool.
call you doctor anyway, regardless. You're from Canada. How did you end up at Liberty University? What did you like about it? What interested you? And we'll get to the bad parts, but let's hear the good parts first.
Right. So born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. When I was little, my family went to church up until about grade 2 or 3, give or take. But then at that point, like every good Canadian family, we started going to the cottage on the weekend and instead went to Waynfleet, Ontario. So anyway, it was between the summer of grade 8 and 9 that my brother Quinn got really into creation versus evolution, that old fun debate. And he was like, Luke, you got to watch these DVDs with me. There were Kent Hovind's DVDs from Pensacola, Florida. If you've heard of Kent Hovind.
I get a lot of requests for Kent Hovind. I haven't covered him yet. I've done Ken Ham, but I
Equally
hear they're
fun.
similar.
Equally fun. Now, I don't know if this is true, and so maybe don't quote me, but I heard that Ken Hovind went to jail for a bit because he said the money that he owed the government was God's money. So render unto Caesar what is Caesar's was apparently not a thing at that point.
Yeah, you know who doesn't believe in God? The IRS.
Right.
they believe in one thing, and we all know what it is.
Oh, wow. So he was watching creationist propaganda videos.
Yeah, and so I got into the thick of that, and then I started going on like different websites and whatnot. And speaking of Ken Ham, I went on to like Answers in Genesis and all of these roller coasters of websites. And so I then at a certain point had decided that because I decided that I fell on the side of creationism at the time. And I said, if in fact I believe that there's a creator, I should probably figure out who this creator is. And so my 14-year-old mind was like, well, probably the God of my childhood church. And so I went back to Forward Baptist Church.
How convenient. Yeah.
Exactly. The answers were there all along. And I went back and I didn't really give up going to church, well, up until after when I was, I guess, in grad school. But along the way, while I was, getting more and more involved in the youth group and in the church there, I had my uncle, or well, my mom's cousin. He was the national recruiter for Liberty in Canada. Also convenient. Again, God was really leading me.
Yeah, I can see why you would think that.
And so he said, Luke, you got to come down for a trip to Virginia. And I said, I don't want to go to Virginia. Like, what? Like, no thanks. And eventually he was like, no, just come down. It'll be a free trip. You'll have fun. It's this big school. If nothing else, you'll have like a fun time. Okay. So I went down on a chartered bus. I actually went down 6 times because I was that in love with the school before I went. And so I got down there. I did fall in love with it because, in Canada, we're not nearly, everything's bigger in America. Let's put it that way. And so seeing this big school with thousands of kids my age and a little bit older, I was like, my gosh, look at this. Like, this is something that I just wasn't used to, because the Canadian evangelical community or population is quite small, particularly in comparison to the States. And so seeing this was just so thrilling. And I thought, if I have to be anywhere for my undergrad, this is the place to be. I need to get my anchor or my my foundation in a Christian education, and then go on from there and change the world. Or I shouldn't say but. There's no but. I went, and I was there for 4 years. And I mean, thinking about the positive things, to this day I still have some very, very good friends from there. I have one friend or a few friends I can think of who I visit on a regular basis, whether it be in North Carolina or up in New York. So definitely some relationships that were phenomenal. The vast majority were not. I mean, like, when I came out, I was excommunicated or deleted off of, social media, or just ignored or gaslit when I did bring up, like, hey, you're seemingly not talking to me anymore. But putting those folks aside, putting aside the really poor education that I received, putting aside the conversion therapy, putting aside the campus culture of homophobia, putting aside, the judgmental sort of atmosphere of the school, it was a lot of fun.
Were you aware before or during, obviously after, but like the culture of Liberty? Like, did people make fun of it or like talk about it before you knew, and you were like, you guys don't know what you're talking about?
I remember one time my brother Zach, he had pulled up this YouTube video of Jerry Falwell Sr. And of course, by the time I was at Liberty, this was Jerry Sr. died in 2007. I had met him when I had come down on those trips, but in 2008, Jerry Jr. had taken over at this point. And nonetheless, of course, the school was founded by this guy. His son was now running the school. And my brother like calls me downstairs and he's like, Luke, like, watch this video with me. It's Jerry Falwell Sr. sitting on the news, and he says, all I remember, it was a Muslim group, but I actually don't remember who these folks were. But he says, blow them away in the name of the Lord. And so you're like, blow them away. And so Zach looks at me and goes, explain this to me. How does this make sense according to your faith? And I was like, I don't. And of course, Jerry
Jr. on that one, I gotta do a little right. Reading.
Climb out. So, and of course, Jerry Jr. picks up on that rhetoric later on when he talks about shooting Muslims on campus. But this having to explain my schools to different folks. I mean, even in high school, my teachers, I went back to my high school years later, and they were like, yeah, Luke, to be honest, like, it just didn't, like, we understood that you were religious because I was the religious kid in high school. It was like, I went to Rosedale Heights School of the Arts and one of maybe 4 Christians, right? Like, just wasn't a place to be a Christian, and that wasn't a cool thing. But my teachers were like, Luke, it just didn't make sense. Like, because I wasn't an idiot in high school, like I was doing well in my classes. And so for them to hear that I was going down to Jerry Falwell School, I mean, all of them were just sort of like shocked and didn't know what to say. And I mean, at this point, I understand why. But, I even knew when I was at Liberty, it became clear to me that when I was going to be applying for grad school, it was going to be an uphill battle, that it wasn't going to be a good look to have attended and graduated from Liberty University. And so I started doing everything I possibly could at the time to, like, make my academic profile to beef it up. So, whether it be presenting at conferences or, submitting for little publications, that kind of stuff. I just knew, and we were told even by professors there that people don't like us. And so, of course, it's like this victim complex, and we're all martyrs. But
yeah, you could take that different ways depending on how you feel about it.
Yeah, and you're sitting there as the paying student like, well, y'all can fix that. Like, we gave you money to not be like that.
Right. So all that to say is, no, the reputation was terrible. I remember one time we were going out for dinner in Rustburg, Virginia. It was just, next door to Lynchburg. And this woman was like, oh, hey, I was like, they're just waiting in line, just being friendly. And she was talking, I think we were talking about something, and she heard us and she started talking with us. And eventually she was like, oh, so where are you guys going to school? And we're like, Liberty. And like the countenance changed, right? Like, it was just like, this moment where she was like, get me out of here. Like, I don't even want to be in line with you folks. But And at the time you're like, well, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not an issue. Like, but then of course realizing that you're a part of the greater culture that has screwed over Central Virginia in a number of ways, screwed over Lynchburg in a number of ways, and also just screwed over the lives of countless folks, whether it be from the pulpit or from the university lectern. But yeah, it made sense later.
Jen and I have talked a lot about liberty, obviously, like through the Falwell episode. It was, a big topic of conversation in the house. And I come at things from kind of a different angle because, I have a full-time day job, and so I don't spend as much time in this realm as Jen does. But one thing I do really like is sports. I like sports, and I found the even before like the channel, I had always found the Liberty football team to be kind of a fascinating thing, because I think it was the most obvious sign of just how bad Liberty wanted to assimilate. It wanted to be considered with those other colleges. So I assume, like, having never been to Liberty or anything like that, I assume like they tried to make it really like, hey, it's just like every other school, and you get to, even though they don't like us, we give a good education, and you can hang out in the quad with your friends, and there's clubs, and I mean, we've all met the overexcited RA. They probably have the overexcited RAs, and stuff like that. So I'm just wondering, like, how it plays out as a student on the ground for you. Like, I imagine there's a lot of like cognitive dissonance of them trying to stand out and fit in so aggressively. How does that play out when you're like a day-to-day student, like just as a young Lucas walking from class to class? Like, what does that look like?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's trying to play both sides of the game, right? That we're just like everyone else, but we're distinctly different. You're like, wait a second, did you just say that in the same breath?
Those are the opposite of each other.
Exactly. And I think, that speaks even to a larger evangelical culture, right? Like, you have these like Hillsong pastors, or you have these like megachurch pastors. They're wearing like the skinny jeans, always like 10 years later. It's never like right on at the same time. They're never on trend, but just a few years later.
We had the same conversation.
You know what I mean? Like, it's a parallel culture that's like 2 steps behind. But it does. If you look at the advertisements, I remember my brother, or pardon me, my sister's fiance, soon to be brother. He was like, I don't even know what Liberty really is. And so I was like, do you want to watch some like YouTube videos? Like, I'll show you what it's like. And so we watched some of the promotional videos, and afterwards, Mark, who's like in no way interested in religion, is not like obviously looking for anything educationally at this point. He's like well established in his career. He makes the joke though. He's like, I want to go there. Like, it makes you think it's this like unbelievable place, right? So often it was playing both sides, where it's like, we are Christian, we are different, we're in this world, we're not of this world. But then the other side of it is, again, like, we're like everyone else. We're like those cool college students. We just don't drink, and we just don't party, and we just don't do X number, Y and Z things. But that was absolutely the MO of the school, or not the MO, at least like the PR of the school, should I say. And so when you're there, again, I think it's very much, it is a parallel culture, where you have these folks who are not saying like the F-bomb, they're instead saying like frickin'. They're not saying like, whatever sort of like derogatory phrase, like take your pick. They're saying something that's similar, just with a few letters.
Yeah, they're
changed.
like, I frickin' hate gay people.
College students written by like Disney Channel writers is what I'm hearing.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And so it was just like, and that was the thing, right? I think that oftentimes too, it was that behind closed doors. So of course that's the PR side, where people on the outside are seeing it. Whereas on the inside, you have people who are they're talking about Jesus. They pray. You see them raising their hands or worshiping, singing whatever during chapel, or what was called convocation when I was there. And then after chapel, they're out there talking, like making like dirty jokes or whatever. But as long as they're around Christian kids, that's what matters. Because of course you don't want to give a bad name for Jesus. You don't have a bad witness. So you do that with your Christian friends. I remember there was this one kid on my hall. He was an atheist, and no one talked to him except for my RA, who really was and is a good guy. No one talked to this one guy, because I think for them, he would have been holding a mirror up to them and saying like, hey, this is who you are. And they didn't want that accountability, because of course they're not keeping each other accountable. And there might be like the Christian accountability, which is nothing. It's just like really talking about like, did you masturbate and look at porn or no, right? Like, that's really what that conversation is. But for anyone else, it's like, for these atheists on campus, or like the very, who are far and few between, I think that would have been a way of saying like, this is who you are. And I can actually like see you from an outsider's perspective. And they didn't want that. So I think that it's very much like this culture of insularity in a way. And I think on top of that too, like they do have things that are like trying to mirror or simulate, maybe is the better word, parts of normal college campus experiences like frats and sororities. Liberty doesn't have frats and sororities. They instead have brother-sister dorms, which are these like really contrived, uncomfortable relationships between two dorms, a guy's dorm and a gal's dorm. And they meet up for like different events. You know, they tailgate together. That's what I learned in America, like a tailgate. This was a new thing for me. But, you know, it was like, there was that kind of stuff. And there were these like weird like relationships that they would form with each other. You know, there would be off-campus dance parties. And we all saw that video of Jerry Falwell Jr. at the comedy show, which I still just want the full footage to know how funny that comedy was. But, you know, another thing. Yeah, so I think that it's trying to simulate a lot of what is a regular college experience with very little success.
That's so interesting, just because I feel like if nothing else at Liberty, you do get a master's degree in code switching, is what I'm hearing. Like you are flipping back and forth at a moment's notice.
Jerry Senior was all about the football, trying to be like,
yeah,
we're mask for mask guys. Like, look at our football team. Like, shut up.
Just like everyone. Just like everyone. Yeah. Well, what did Jerry say? He used to always talk about how we're the Notre Dame, as Notre Dame is for Catholics, as you know, Brigham Young is for Mormons, Liberty is for evangelicals.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, it's like, and the idea of having, again, an evangelical university and what Liberty now has on campus, an evangelical think tank, like a contradiction in terms, I think, but I digress.
Yes. Would you like to talk about your experience with conversion therapy at Liberty?
Yeah, so conversion therapy at Liberty, the way that they had framed it, as many evangelical institutions do, they called it, they had a name for the group. There was a group that you could go to. Though when I was there, my memory is that we weren't able to go to the group unless we made enough progress in one-on-one counseling. But what you could do is that you could meet up for appointments with this guy named Dane Emmerich, if in fact you were, to use the rhetoric that's used on campus and in other evangelical spaces, struggling with same-sex attraction. And so there were these signs, and actually when I came down to Liberty to check it out, to see if I wanted to go there, they had the sign in chapel that, you know, there was these rotating ads or whatever for things going on campus. And one of the things was, if in fact you're struggling with same-sex attraction, you can go talk to Pastor Dane. And so I took, of course, a mental note and started asking folks later. I was like, so tell me about this thing I saw.
My friend's having some gay thoughts.
Yeah. You might need to go to that Dane character. Yeah, and so Pastor Dane was the conversion therapist's name. He is thankfully retired, though, of course, at this point, I'm pretty sure there's someone in his stead. But when I was there, he was the main person. For guys, there was someone else for gals, but I, of course, wasn't going to anyone else but Dane. And so when I first decided that I wanted to go, my big plan when I got to Liberty was that I was going to go to Liberty and date Christian guys, because I thought in high school, well, I can't obviously date anyone because that's going to be, again, a bad witness for Jesus. But all of a sudden, if I'm around a bunch of other Christians, well, I can go date, have a few years of dating guys. At the end, go to conversion therapy, change, find a wife. Off I go back home to Canada, and God will be on her throne, and that'll be that. That, of course, didn't happen. What happened was there was this one, we'll call it a romantic rendezvous with one of my spiritual life directors on my hall. He and I had a weird encounter. And after that, I was like freaking out because I, up until that point, had never had a queer experience with anyone. And so this was my first moment, or, again, entry point into being gay, or at least acting on it.
It was hypothetical before, and now it's real, and you have to deal with it.
Other than the one person I told on MySpace years and years and years before that, other than him, and he told me he wouldn't tell anyone.
I was gonna say, he never forgot.
He's still out there holding that secret. I have a weird encounter with my spiritual life director.
And he and I, or afterwards, I texted him. I was like, yo, we need to talk about what happened. And he's like, no, we do, because I need to talk. For me, I am, not a quiet person. I am not one who keeps to myself. And so I needed to hash it out. And he said no. And so I of course had no one to talk to. It's not like I'm going to call anyone back home, be like, hey, guess what? Like, or anyone on campus, that's social suicide. Like, you're not about to, tell people and then people not want to talk to you because you're the gay kid. So I knew that I had no one with whom I could speak. So I decided that I had to fast track my plan and reach out to this conversion therapist. So I made up a fake email. And actually, speaking about football, I did my best because I thought to myself, I want to reach out to this guy, but I didn't want to use either the email that I applied to the school with or the email that, of course, Liberty had given me. So I made an email, and the email was, I was like, how do I make something as far away from 18-year-old Luke as possible? And the email was Texas football fan something. Because I'm from Canada, I obviously don't play football. Put those together, that's the email. So I reach out to him and I was like, hey, can I come speak with you? And if I do, can will the university find out, or will my mom find out, or like, will my dorm find out? As if like any of that would have happened, but other than maybe
I would believe it.
Yeah, you're right.
Cover your butt.
I think it was like from you, yeah, the university, absolutely. Anyway, I digress. And so he says, nope, unless you're going to self-harm, there's no way I'm going to reach out to anyone or tell anyone what we talked about. So I said, okay. So I go to this meeting, and it was the first time I went, in the first maybe month or so of going, it was like very pseudo-Freudian. It was like, tell me about your relationship with your mom.
All the stories that you tell me are not even just you, but like any conversion therapy stuff I hear, they literally, for people that hate psychiatry so much, they literally just follow a Freud handbook.
That's why they hate psychology, is because that's when they stopped reading psychology books.
It was like, just because he wanted to bang his mom doesn't mean that that's like valid for anybody else. So I think that's really funny. Sorry.
Well, no, it's true though, right? Like, they take what they want and they leave what they don't. And actually, speaking to that, when Dane asked about my mom and dad, I half fit the narrative, because the narrative is that you have an overbearing mother, guilty, and you have an absentee or emotionally distant father. Not the case. Like, my dad was phenomenal. In fact, my dad was arguably much more involved in my life than my mom and knew much more about me than my mom. So nonetheless, they took that narrative and were like, okay, let's pretend that your dad wasn't. Like, let's just put that to the side and let's just focus in on your mom. And so again, it's really like, it's like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Like, you take what you want and you leave what you don't. And so after that, the weekly meetings that we had, it would be things like, we always started with an inventory of what I had done that week, whether it had been, he's like, tell me your victories. So these moments that, for instance, things like, oh, you didn't look at porn. Instead, you called your friend and said like, hey, let's go for a walk. Or like, hey, I bounced my eyes. Or, I looked away from whoever I thought was attractive. And then the other parts were like your slip ups, things that you did that were wrong, or quote unquote sinful. And he would ask you very detailed questions about a lot of it, and was very interested in all the details. And then from there, he would be the one to pray for me, not me pray for myself, which of course is very telling that he was like interceding on my behalf. We read scripture. We had a book. My textbook was Growth into Manhood, Resuming the Journey by Alan Mettinger. And it was just like a bunch of just like wild, suggestions. My favorite of which was, if in fact you, because what the whole conversion therapy premise is, it's not at its core being gay. At its core, it's not an issue of sexuality. It's an issue of gender identity. So according to this theory, I misaligned at a young age my gender identity to such an extent that I didn't really fit into the world of men, or what it means to be capital M masculine. And if only I were at this point in my life to realign myself with the masculine and the world of men, which once I do that, I will then realign my sexual orientation. So that'll follow. And so they gave you these different tips, and they said, oftentimes they'd say things like, well, it's not a matter of what you do that'll make you straight. It's just a matter of what you do that'll make you straight. And you're like, sorry, what the hell did you just say? And so,
read that back.
Yeah, and I quote, no, but they would say things like that. And so they said like, well, if you do sports, or if you play sports, you can tell me sports I play, you do sports. If you play sports, or if you, do this, or this, then what's going to happen is eventually over time, if you habituate these actions, you will become a masculine guy. And then after that, your sexuality again will change in turn. And that, of course, never happened. But I love the suggestions that they gave me. And my favorite of which from that book was, they said things along the lines of like, if only you were to do like carpentry, like if you picked up a hammer or whatnot. I was like, you want me to like work with wood? Like, I don't think you're asking me what you think you're asking me to do. But that was it, right? Like that was very much this weird, like, talk about an action-based sort of treatment or regimen, which of course is very different than what of course we've been told, but it's by faith alone, not by works. But in this case, to become straight, one needs to do the things that men do. And so that's what we did for over 4 years. A lot of silliness like that.
The thing that I keep getting from all this is that it's basically like gender performance class. They're acknowledging that like gender is a spectrum and that you can, and it's like, you're so close. You're so close, but instead it just,
But it's also hilarious to me because it's like, y'all really just done built a whole quote unquote curriculum off the stereotypes you had in your head that moment. I'm sure they really wanted carpentry to be straight for obvious reasons. They really don't want carpentry to be gay because that would introduce a whole lot of questions they don't want to deal with.
Why is it that straight men always know what's gay? Why did they decide what the rules are? Because they seem to be the only ones that like care.
Right. Well, and I think too what you're saying as well is like that how culturally specific their understanding of masculinity and femininity is. And it's just funny that they talk about that it's all about this like very you have to be masculine, but of course masculinity has changed throughout the centuries, but of course according to their idea God hasn't. And so it's like it's just such selective hearing or selective thinking, if we can even call it thinking, or logic, if we can even call it logic, that's undergirding what they're saying. It's like that they're pushing for a very culturally specific sort of idea, but also pushing for what they believe to be absolute truth, which is of course in their estimation eternal. And so it doesn't fit, it's not consistent. But Jen, what you were saying, it absolutely, like to quote Troye Sivan from Boy Erased, he says, "So play the part, man." I love the man, right? That affected man. But it's playing the part. That's what they're pushing you to do, so that your entire life is a charade.
I've been reading this book, but it's called Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. It just came out. I don't know if you've read any of it, but they talk a lot about how there was a concerted effort from like people high up in the Southern Baptist Convention and just Focus on the Family and all those types of groups. They wanted to change the way people thought about Christianity because it wasn't masculine enough. They thought it was too soft and Jesus was not like a warrior, like hardcore guy. And then they changed the image on purpose to make him more masculine, to start using military metaphors in how they evangelize people. But it's just funny how like this is on purpose. This isn't like just a coincidence that Christians decided on this is how masculinity is going to be. Like,
well, yeah. Even like the speakers that they would invite to campus, right? They had all these, invited pastors, preachers, politicians, which were always strangely mixed in. But there's this one guy, I think his name on Twitter, he blocked me on Twitter. His name is, what is it? Tim the Evangelist Lee. He's the head, you should check him out. He's just wild. He's the head of Liberty's board of trustees right now, if I'm not mistaken. And the guy is just all about this like uber machismo. The things that he says are just outlandish, and it's all about this like the sense of hyper masculinity that he really pushes for. But again, like he's one of many speakers, because he did come and speak when I was there, but there were a number of these folks who would come and speak, and this is the culture that they're creating. It is very intentional, right? Like it's a curated decision to have these individuals speak. Of course, that trickles down into the student body, and then the student body goes from there. And these are, again, a lot of people who are trained to be pastors, a lot of people who are training to go into the professions. And this is what they're trying to create. They're trying to create this campus culture so that it bleeds out and beyond. And I think that's the thing about Liberty. Liberty's not just a reflection of evangelicalism, it's a shaper of it, right? It's a powerhouse institution that shapes the political, cultural, social landscape of America because of the just vast demographic that is evangelicalism.
And I think that like it's one thing I know that Jen and I were talking about before we came on with you was that the interesting the kind of dual nature of conversion therapy, or whatever you want to call it, is that it's inherently secret, right? It has to be in order to survive. And I think that creates a lot of misconceptions about what it looks like. And it creates, and I think it's why you have a lot of people going like later in life, it's one of the only types of mental health treatment or program I've seen where it's like people later in life seeing documentaries and being like, did I go to that as a kid? Like, people aren't figuring it out. And I think that I say all that to say that I think that the nature of conversion therapy leads to a lot of misconceptions. And we know that you're really an expert in the field. You've done research into this very clandestine, closed off thing, not only, being a participant in a form of it, but also researching it. So I'm curious about like, what are some of the big misconceptions about conversion therapy or the idea of conversion therapy that you think are important to dispel?
Yeah, I think the major misconceptions about conversion therapy is that it's not happening anymore. Or that's one of the major misconceptions, that people believe this is not going on anymore. But there are tens of thousands of people who undergo conversion therapy every single year, whether it be because they want to, should I say. Of course, like you're not, it's not that you want to, it's that you're told you want to. No one willfully goes into conversion therapy in a strict sense, right? The idea of agency, I think, is quite limited when we're talking about people within evangelical spaces, particularly queer folks within these evangelical spaces, being told, this is your desire. You want this heteronormative model of happiness, when of course that's not queer people's idea of happiness, but we know it's peddled, and people believe it. But I think first of all, that people think it doesn't exist. On top of that, a lot of times you hear about these ministries, quote unquote, of folks who are supporting people who are struggling with same-sex attraction, right? That they're discipling these people who are struggling with same-sex attraction, whatever word they want to use to mask it, whatever euphemism, perhaps more correctly, to mask what they're doing. And so you have these people who say, I'm not trying to change anyone's sexuality. I'm just trying to support them and living a celibate life, the gift of celibacy, like what a gift that is.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. But it's this way of saying we're not trying to change anyone, when in fact behind closed doors that's precisely what they're trying to do, right? That this idea of supporting, what does that mean to support someone who can't access a huge part of who they are? Of course, people's sexuality is not the totality of who they are, but it certainly is part of it, right? And and it's funny too, you have oftentimes this erasure of queer sexuality, because people say like, oh, we don't want to listen to you and you gays or you queers or whatever. It's like, but of course they don't realize how much of their life revolves around their sexuality, how much of what they say and do revolves around their heterosexuality. But for whenever we as queer people express our sexuality in any way, shape, or form, it's magnified and it's seen, and it's all the more pronounced because people aren't used to that. And so for us queers, when we have any expression of our queer desire, or just being gay or lesbian or bi or whatnot, it's seen as this big announcement, this big political act. Meanwhile, it's a political act every time anyone does it. But thinking about conversion therapy again, and what happens there that people don't understand is that, I think another part that I think is actually super important is this idea of not just protecting youth from conversion therapy. Because I think even for some people who say, I'm against conversion therapy, but people should ultimately have the choice to choose conversion therapy or choose, whatever else. And it's like, I don't think in any, iteration, abuse should be a choice, right? That no matter what, and of course, even like the 2019 UN Rapporteur on Torture talked about how conversion therapy in different expressions is a form of torture. And so I don't think anyone should also have access to that either. So I'd say the three main things are, it still exists. Two, what people call, what they might call it anything else but conversion therapy, but what it is exactly that, conversion therapy. And three, that no one should have the option for conversion therapy because it's literally never worked, right? Like that's one thing that people obviously know, but it's worth saying. It's literally never worked. But on top of that, abuse should never be an option. because you should never be going to therapy after going to quote unquote therapy. That doesn't make sense to me.
It's very frustrating to me the way when you talk about like the efficacy of being zero, and I just because the thing is, like, coming from, I have a background in mental health. I did move to HR. Sorry, everyone. Career change. It's frustrating to me because even, back in my casework days, if a parent came to me and was like, hey, can you show me like the background of this technique you're using and the efficacy just so I can make sure? You're darn right I can. No one ever asked, unfortunately, but I could. If someone asked at a moment's notice, I could say, here are the studies this is based on. Here's the curriculum that was built out of that. Here's the research that shows that if we follow the principles in this way over time, it'll work. But people like Dane are just able to go, it's in the Bible, and people just let them practice.
Yeah, the 10 ex-gay people that exist and go to parades do not count as like proof.
Yeah.
Well, those are the people who, you find them as headless torsos on Grindr late at night. You know what I mean? That's how efficacious conversion therapy is. No,
Not too far.
That watered my eyes a little bit.
But it's true though.
You're not wrong.
They go into that life of secrecy, and I think that going back to the idea of secrecy, like when I was on campus, it was totally secret because of course you weren't advertising you were going to conversion therapy. But I think part of what comes with that secrecy is a level of ignorance, because you're not sharing with people that you're going to conversion therapy, so you don't know how crazy it is. I remember the first time I told someone after Liberty, I was in my office at McMaster University up in Hamilton, Ontario, and my office mate, we were talking, and she started talking about masturbation. And being the evangelical that I was like overwhelmed with a woman talking about masturbation. And I was like, oh my gosh, how do I navigate this conversation? And then it turned into me telling her eventually just, that, I do my best not to do that. And she was like, what in the world? She's like, Luke, I masturbated 3 times this morning. I'm like, oh my gosh. And so like from there, I said, well, when I went to this program essentially that was trying to make me straight. And she was like, wait, what? And I said, like, yeah. And I didn't identify it as conversion therapy, but she was like, you mean conversion therapy? And it was that moment that I realized this is crazy. But up until that point, I never thought it was weird that I went to conversion therapy. I thought it was something to be ashamed of. I thought it was something that I didn't want people to know about. But if someone did know, I never felt weird because the people I had told until that point, because she was the first person outside of the church that I had told, I should have said. But within the church, there were a number of people who I had told, maybe like 5 or 6 friends. And so with them, I never felt weird. Again, I felt ashamed because I felt like this isn't right, this is sinful. But with her, all of a sudden I realized it was weird. But again, the reason it felt weird only for the first time then was because of the secrecy that surrounded it. And I think that's part of what keeps these people so insular and really cut off from any sort of resources or any sort of lifeline that they might have or want to have, because they're so ashamed of who they are and they have to live in this queer subterfuge because it's social suicide again to go outside of that, or to be vocal about it, should I say.
I think it's fair to say that most conversion therapy could be considered sexual abuse. And the stuff that you talk about, I forgot his name. You probably wish you could forget his name too. Dane, the guy that was in charge. The stuff that he was doing sounds exactly like grooming techniques you would do to a child, except you're an adult, and the fact that it's the same exact thing. And he's like, it's our little secret. I want you to tell me every single little detail, describe it, like all that. And I guess that was more of a statement than a question, but there you go.
And to build on that, I mean, I can even remember when I was, and at the time, I don't know, I noticed it, but looking back, it's become all the creepier. And that was that at the beginning of every meeting, he'd give me a big bear hug, and then at the end, he'd give me a big bear hug. But then on top of that, when we were praying, he would lay his hands on me. And I think to myself at this point, I think that I have no idea what he was thinking in some ways, but I'm not saying he was being creepy per se. Totally a possibility, but I have no idea. The other part of it though is I think that what he was trying to do was show me like good touch, bad touch, right? This like very elementary, weird thing, but it's like a way of, sort of grooming me in a way to say like, this is how men should touch. This is how, men should. And it was just a very manipulative, bizarre, weird thing. And it wasn't just me, because I've talked to friends who also went through conversion therapy with Dane, and they've said the same things, that he would always put his hands, like he'd always lay his hands on me. And, I can still feel like those warm hands on my knee, or, him giving that big hug. And it's looking back, it's very bizarre.
I saw this interview with somebody who went through conversion therapy, and his therapist would pretend that he was his mom and like beat him with a bottle and just all this stuff that it's just like, since it's not real therapy and none of this is backed up by anything, they literally are just making stuff up, and they're like, if I touch him this way, maybe that'll help.
Yeah, this might work. This might work.
And that's why I say this stuff to all y'all people out there. If you're going to anybody who calls themselves a therapist, counselor, they're counseling you, therapizing, whatever the word is they're using, you're allowed to ask for their credentials and the efficacy of what they're doing. And if they can't provide it, turn yourself around and walk out the door. That's very important to me. I'm sorry.
No, and it should be important to everyone, right? Because otherwise you have these people who are masquerading as these, counselors or therapists or whatever, and they have no education to back it up other than reading. And again, we
book.
call this an education. Yeah, the book, or like the 2-3 books, the Joe Dallas book, or
this is legal because it's not, they're not claiming to be licensed therapists, and so it's okay. It's just a church program.
Virginia passed the law to ban conversion therapy. They passed it not too long ago. So the thing is, up until that point, and that was, again, that's for minors. And so if there were students at Liberty, which there are, like you have some homeschool kids who like graduated when they're like 15 and somehow are at university at that point. If they were underage, then they could have, at this point they can, file for some sort of like
a settlement.
Yeah, or something like that, or like charge them, or like, sue them or whatnot. However, before that, no one was protected, right? So youth or otherwise, no one was protected. And so there, at Liberty, again, it's all of these sort of verbal gymnastics that they use. So instead of saying, again, like, we're a licensed therapist, well, they couldn't even do that if they wanted to, because they're not, or the people who were testing wasn't. I don't really know the legality around it, to be honest. So I'm falling apart too. That's such an insidious part of it too, right? That you have these folks who are so eager to change, and they desperately want to change. Because again, when you're a kid and you're in a culture that you can't be gay, right? You're told that this is not allowed, and you have the promise that you can change. My gosh, you're excited. And so when you're in conversion therapy, for the first year, you're thinking, you're convincing yourself, I'm making progress. Second year, you're still doing your best to convince yourself. Third year, it's a little bit of a struggle. Fourth year, you're like, I still really want this to happen. Nothing's really changing. And, then you go on past that. And for me, that was my 4 years at Liberty. Then I got to McMaster. And once I was there, it was like, I remember standing over my sink. It was like this night I was about to go to the pub. It was a winter night, and I was in my half basement apartment, and I'm standing over my sink, like just crying, like, what the hell, God? Like, why? And again, I was very religious up until about a few years after Liberty, but I was standing there over my sink, and I'm saying, like, what the hell, God? Like, I've tried and I've tried and I've tried. I've gone to this therapy. I have read my Bible. I have prayed for this. I have read all these books. I have done everything in my power to change. What is going on? Right? Like, I have done everything that I was supposed to do, and yet I'm still unable to change. And so it's this optimism, and what, the scholar Lauren Berlant, who just passed away, she has this idea of cruel optimism, right? That your object of desire, what you want, is precluded from its very inception. That you want something, and yet you, even from the outset of wanting it, will never get that. And so it's this cycle of trying and trying and trying. And what happens is when you try and try and try, you at first feel guilty because it's not, it's like, oh, I'm guilty. Oh, I did this. But then over time, you realize it's the problem is you, right? In the sense that you can't change, right? You are not able to. No one's able to. And so you then have this sense of shame that turns inwards, and it's you start hating yourself. And that's what's so cruel about this, right? That you have this promise to change, and it never freaking happens.
I think it is an extension of, at least for Liberty, it's an extension of American capitalism, the individualization of all problems, because it contributes to the message. Being gay is your problem. It's not a social problem how you're treated. We don't even need to address that. Don't look behind the curtain. Focus on you and what's wrong with you, and make it about you. I just think those two things go hand in hand.
I think so too, yeah.
A lot of things in conversion therapy are very similar to what the Nazis were doing, and their understanding of sexuality, and how it's all, it falls under the larger umbrella of eugenics. Do you care to have any thoughts on that or some of the similarities?
So I'm always terrified of making any comparisons between any historical events, because like they're obviously such different moments in time in history. And for me, what happened was I was at Northwestern. I was doing a summer program there at they have the Holocaust Educational Foundation. They have a summer institute for 2 weeks. It's just a phenomenal program. And one of the historians who came, Dagmar Herzog from CUNY in New York, she was talking all about the Holocaust and sexuality and gender, and sort of like making these connections. And so we went around the room and told all of our research interests, and she was, firing off. Yeah, you've heard about this, have you heard about this? Well, she starts talking about Nazi understandings of sexuality. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, this is exactly like what I was taught in conversion therapy. So I went up to her afterwards, because the idea that one's sexuality is mutable, it can be changed, right? And that if you could prove to the Nazis that you were able to change, you could actually, get out of your punishment or whatnot. Of course, that probably didn't happen very often, and I don't know the details about that because that's not my area of research. But that there was this idea of mutability. One can change one's sexuality. So I went up to Dagmar afterwards, and I waited in line because everyone wanted to talk to her because she's a superstar. And afterwards, I said, "Hey, I'm Luke Wilson. I just have to ask you this question." I said, "I'm listening to you the entire time you're speaking about, Nazi understandings of sexuality." And I said, "It is uncannily familiar, because I heard essentially all of what you were talking about in conversion therapy at Liberty University." So before she gave me her answer, she said, "Please just let me give you a big hug." And that's because I went through conversion therapy and because I went to Liberty. And then she said, "Luke, no one's ever written on this topic, but you're going to write about this. And I need a person who speaks German. My German is not very good. So I'll need to wait to find a study buddy to do that with."
Leave in the comments below if you speak German and you want to help Luke.
Help me. And the power of YouTube. All that to say is that there are connections, there are parallels, and of course, like a lot of conversion therapy thinking was mobilized after the Nazis. Of course, there was stuff before as well. It goes back, I believe, to the 1800s and of course the early 1900s. But my question at this point, my academic question is, are there any direct intellectual inheritances from Nazi Germany or those who were writing about sexuality around that same time and now? And I'm not saying that conversion therapists are Nazis. That's not my argument. In fact, like, that's a very different political regime, but nonetheless, they probably have some tendencies. But again, I'm not saying they're Nazis. What I am saying, though, and I think it's a damning critique, is that if ever you have an understanding of sexuality that is the same or a similar understanding of sexuality to Nazis, I digress, right? Like, I'll drop the mic there. It's like, that is a damning critique. I wouldn't want any part of me to mirror or rhyme with Nazism, right? Like, that doesn't seem like a good look.
Well, and it's odd too, because we talked about because Nazis were also super into performative gender. All of their stuff was the, blonde, hyper masculine dude with his shirt off for some reason, in their stuff. So they believe kind of in not only the same gender dichotomy, but how it plays out. And I think there's an inherent vilification of what's seen as the sickly, weaker other. And, evangelicalism believes that, just as the Nazis did and showed it in their propaganda. And I think that that's where their fear of queer culture and greater society comes from, is that things are moving towards and understanding that those weak, sickly folks you were talking about, quote unquote, the other, they have important things to say and we should treat them better.
I also think too, it's funny that you say like the Aryan man, the blonde man, standing with his shirt up or whatever. It's like the amount of homosocial or homoerotic, depending on how we're looking or defining the term, imagery or rhetoric that's in both of these traditions, yet is somehow masked as straight. It's like, what? Is anyone else watching this? Or like,
bloody sexy Jesus? I know.
You were talking earlier about how they were trying to masculinize Jesus in the church, and I was thinking earlier, I'm like, honestly, they should just start worshiping Leonidas. I feel like that's who they want. Is the guy from 300. You don't want the carpenter hippie. You want the warrior who does gay stuff on the side, but it's cool because he's tough. That's who you want. Just worship that movie like we all know you wanted to.
I love it. Well, it's like, even if you read these conversion therapy manuals, they'll be talking and you're like, is this a gay porno or is this a conversion therapy manual, right? They'll be talking about things, they'll say things, like you need to know what it's like to play sports with other men and have their hot, sweaty bodies rub up against you on the field. And you're like, wait a second, like, what are you telling me to do? Like,
You did that. Do I get extra points?
Yeah. This was supposed to be making me feel better. This is making me deal with new things now.
And I just think it's just like this really overlooked aspect of it all, of these cultures, these conservative cultures, particularly of course evangelicalism, that it's very homosocial, homoerotic. And yet it's like, if you think about Exodus International, and of course they're defunct and they're, done with, and there's a new documentary coming out, Pray Away. And them, like, they were like, hey, let's have a conference at a hotel with a bunch of ex-gays.
It's like the Olympic Village.
Right. Like,
what do you think is gonna happen?
I was just gonna say, you talked about an underground gay community at Liberty. Recently in my Jerry Jr. video, I talked about there are gay advocacy groups at Liberty now, and they actually have protests. And you said you had an atheist dorm mate. Like, I don't even know what I'm trying to say. I'm sorry. I'm saying that there are gay people at Liberty, and they seem to be doing pretty well, I guess.
So there is a gay underground there. I would not call them thriving. I would not call, and I don't in no way like a judgmental sense, in the sense that how could one thrive at a Christian university that's as conservative as Liberty, right? And these are folks. So my first article came out, my queerty article, I had a bunch of Liberty students reach out, a number of queer Liberty students specifically. And so the folks in the protest, there are a few of them in there who I'm now, pals with. And one of them has actually written her own article through Queerty as well. Phenomenal piece, really, really insightful as to what it's like to be a lesbian at Liberty in particular. But when talking to these folks, and I'm now a part of the Facebook group that that they've started, and hearing them talk about sexuality, hearing them talk about dating, hearing them talk about what it's like to be queer, and like whether or not they should even go back to Liberty. There's been this hot debate, do I even go back after the COVID thing? Do I even go back after just in general after the end of this like semester or whatnot? And these folks, my heart goes out to them. Like they're in a different position than I was in, because when I was there at Liberty, I didn't have a queer group. I had a few friends who were gay who identified as struggling with same-sex attraction, but we weren't like a gay group. Whereas these folks do have a group that they can, talk with each other, and that's phenomenal. However, it's still a group of people who are forced into secrecy. It's still a group who can't be open and public. There are a few, for instance, my friend Tessa, she did wear, her pride shirt. She did have bumper stickers on her laptop and whatnot, but she also got a lot of really awful, dirty looks. There was one time she told me that she was sitting in the library and this guy came up, passed by the laptop and was like staring as he was passing by. Then he came and sat right down next to her, stood up, looked at her laptop right in front of her, got out his phone, started laughing and taking photos. And this is the kind of treatment that is acceptable and if anything encouraged at Liberty, right? It's not like any RA would be like, hey, don't be mean to the queer kid, right? Like that's not their concern. And so seeing or hearing about that and knowing that there are other folks out there who were even too terrified to put a bumper sticker on their laptop, I can't say that this is a community that is all that, is doing all that well. So that's one thing. The other part is this idea that that Liberty does not reflect its student body. I do think it does reflect its student body. I think there are aberrant exceptions. I think like when I was there was one atheist on my hall of 60 guys. I wouldn't say that he's the reflection of Liberty. What I would say is that the vast majority of Liberty students are in line with Liberty's doctrinal views, Liberty's, social, like political views. Of course, there are people who disagree. Of course, there's a whole spectrum within that demographic. But I thought when my articles came out that there would be more, just because I thought that that once at the time that I first wrote, there wasn't. No, Jerry Jr. was acting the fool at that point as well. So I can't even say that. But I thought that there would be more people responding negatively. That was what I actually thought, that once I published anything that people were going to come after me or whatnot, like Liberty students. And when the article came out, I got very little response that was negative, because I don't think a lot of them were reading it, because I don't think a lot of them are reading major news outlets. I don't think a lot of them are reading in general. But at least not the same, media that I'm reading. And so I think that when I think about Liberty students and like, what is the face of Liberty, I think it is pretty much what you see is what you get. I do think, though, that of course it's not monolithic, and that people who make assumptions saying, and in fact, I'm quite glad that not everyone judges and says, oh, Liberty equals canceled, because I would have never gotten into grad school. However, what I can say is that when I got to Vanderbilt, before I got to Vanderbilt, I had an interview to get for admission, and I thought to myself, nowhere on the website does it say that there are interviews. Well, I get into that interview, and the dean of admissions at the time, she says, Luke, I'm going to cut right to the chase. She's like, we just don't understand why you're applying here since you went to Liberty University. And I was like, I think I made it pretty clear in my application. And she was like, no, maybe you just want to like rehash that and tell me exactly why, because we just want to really make sure that you're gonna, essentially like fit, you're the right fit. And of course, eventually I was the right fit, and I got in and I went. But that goes to show you that there's a lot of suspicion. And I think there should be suspicion. I'm not saying that everyone again should be canceled if they went to Liberty, because again, I know a number of very smart people who went there, who do not fit that mold. However, I would say that the majority do.
Liberty just baffles me, because in no other context would there ever be allowed to be a college or a place that, I guess they're accredited now, aren't they? But I mean, barely. But like, there's no other context would there be allowed to be a college that is openly homophobic, plus all the other things that Jerry Jr. has done. But it's like, oh, it's okay, they're Christian.
Isn't that the thing, right? I in most of my pieces, and in any chance I get to say, like, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, like, how in the world have they not gone on a deep dive into the campus culture of Liberty, right? Like, the fact that a university in 2021 is a conversion therapy program, the fact that, there are openly racist comments made by the president, professors, and who knows who else, right? The fact that there's so much going on in these camps, like the sexual assault, if you've listened to the recent season of Gangster Capitalism, right? That they're talking about the sexual assault on campus, it's just wild. And the way that Liberty has dealt with these folks, and these are only the folks who have come forward. There have to be more, right? Mm-hmm. Like, there's just no way that these are like the two isolated instances, that they found coincidentally, right? Like, it's a part of this greater culture. And on top of that, we haven't even really touched on the academics, though I've made a few, allusions to the quality of education that I received there. The quality of education is mind-blowing. Like, when I got to McMaster, I was so up a creek, and I had no idea the basic premise of what we were talking about in class. We were in these classes and we were reading articles and books, and they started talking, and I'd be sitting there thinking to myself, like, what? And like, they're speaking another language right now, because I was so ill prepared. And I eventually said to my supervisor there, I said, I am not stupid. I promise you I'm not stupid. I just need you to train me. Like, tell me what you want me to do and I will do it. I just don't know how to go about the field of English, because I'm mostly in literary studies. And so once I got it. But again, it was that I didn't have those basic building blocks that Liberty should have taught me. Boy, oh boy, did I know how to do grammar, right? Like, I really, knew about those grammar rules, emphasis on the rules. Evangelicals love rules. But when it came to the critical thinking, when it came to the actual conventions of academia, I had no idea. And so, and that's just like, and then on top of that, if we do want to talk about content and what was taught, I still have the PowerPoints that were given to me while in the one class, contemporary issues, which was looking at these like contemporary issues like gay marriage and
I was gonna wonder what they were.
Right, yeah, right. And from there, we had these PowerPoints that were giving you all these like really horrible, like, gay men died X number of years, sooner. Like, this gay men have this cancer or, whatever, like illness, like much sooner. Like, gay men have AIDS, and it's all this kind of stuff, like fear mongering tactics that was shrouded as academic content. And that, again, how in the world can a university be teaching this? And again, there's so much more that to be disclosed eventually, I suppose, and maybe there's gonna be some big expose on the quality of education that'll be eventually published. But my whole point is that the university, how it treats its students, and then what it teaches its students, based on both of those two premises, I'm baffled that the school is accredited.
They're just like, wasting everybody's time and money, it sounds like. And you think you're getting a good education when you go, and then you try to get a job and they're like, oh, is this guy a Bible thumper? You know, that's unfortunate.
Well, even too, like I know people who used to work in the career center, and they said like the number of people who would come to them and say like, no one's hiring me. Like my degree, my online degree in like social work or whatever they were getting, or like mental health counseling, whatever they called it. And
I'd be sus if it came from Liberty, but yeah, I get what you're
and they were just like, no one's hiring me. What's going on? And it's like, I don't know. Maybe you went to Liberty University and you have an online degree. Like, what do you expect?
One last thing. Do you know how do you say his name? Do you know who Milo
Milo
Yiannopoulos is?
Yiannopoulos,
Okay.
Yeah, didn't he just start a new conversion therapy?
Yeah, he just started his own camp. Okay.
You know
He's
something.
gonna probably speak at Liberty soon. Watch.
Oh my gosh. Here's the thing. So Jerry Prevost, the president of Liberty, is a notorious homophobe from Alaska. He really railed against like the queer community there for years, and then of course, made good friends with Jerry Senior and Junior, and is now the acting president of Liberty. I would not be surprised if in fact he had someone like him, if not him, come to Liberty.
I mean, I only saw like the headlines. I'm a fake fan. I haven't actually looked it up. Does he have like a girlfriend now, or what's he?
No. I've looked into this. He's still living with the husband, but now they're just not gay anymore.
They're just roommates now.
Yeah, legitimately. So I don't know, man.
Good for him.
So I don't know if the roommate situation, and what exactly. So he's claiming that he's just pals now.
Well, yeah. He's like, no, my husband still lives in the house, and yes, technically we're still married. No, yeah, okay, yes, but but I'm straight. Like,
is the husband on board? Like, is he like also ex-gay?
People don't know the husband's name. I don't know if you've known anything about this. He is completely hidden. The most we have is the back of a.
Says he's been sodomy. He's sodomy free, everyone. So
yeah,
thank God.
But all that we know is that his husband is a black man, and because all we've ever gotten is one wedding photo of the back of his head, and no one knows his name. He's never given an interview. Like, he's just this mythical, off in the distant figure.
I'll put the picture up on the screen.
There it is. That's the picture.
Well, he can't see it.
Oh shoot.
Well, it says "blind for love" on the back, because a lot of these ex-gay people, they're just trying to like suck up to evangelicals, and I'm like, they don't want you. Why do you want somebody's respect and adoration that doesn't like you? But I also understand it's like, you've been church good, gay bad. I know that's hard to break, but I just don't like to spend time with people that hate me.
No, strange. Strange how that works. No, I bet you he's going to work, whatever that work looks like, and coming home and living the life that he lived before. Like, is that also like anyone else's like first thought that he's not doing this in real life? He's just doing this in one sense and then going home to his regular life.
People like Milo, at least, he doesn't care about adoration. He wants attention. He doesn't care. He doesn't care how you're looking at him.
Attention is love to some people, though.
Yeah, that's all he knows.
Even, you think about like the people who are the most ardent upholders of tradition are oftentimes those who are most oppressed, right? So you have these people who are ex-gays, and they're given like this little bit of extra territory within the evangelical church and like authority, or again, attention, really, privilege, whatever you want to call it. And they really grasp onto that, and they defend it, tooth and nail, because they don't have anything else really. And so when they get a little bit more of territory, a little more attention, a little more whatever, they become the ones who are like the protectors of that. And so I think to myself, like, when you find these people who are ex-gays and they're loving it, of course they are, because they have nothing else within the evangelical church other than this, or they're outside, right? Like, they're going to go back to the world and be back to square one. Whereas within the church, they have some sort of audience, so they're going to take it.
The one nice thing we can say about conversion therapy is that by its very nature, the more we talk about it, the faster we get to making it a reality that it's not a thing anymore. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much for spreading the word, for taking time to sit down and chat with us, and for using a platform like this and all the ones you've created to just kill this thing off for good.
We're doing our best. Yeah. And thank you guys. Honestly, your website, I'm like a 90-year-old woman, man. Like I'm just like your website, like the World Wide Web. No, like you guys are fucking amazing. Like I love you guys and like what you do. And then I also love the power move, and I'm just gonna do my makeup.
Yes. Oh.
I
I guess I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just like I'm gonna do my makeup, bitch. Like here we go. Like it's just friggin' amazing.
This has been an awesome conversation. You're so much fun to talk to. Where can the people find you because of your name that's very similar to a celebrity's?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson, and I am on Twitter at Wilson_F as in Frederick W.
Well, it's been lovely having you. Thank you for stopping by, telling us your story, advocating for the people.
Hey, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.